The first autumn rain arrived earlier than anyone expected. It painted the streets of Ashford, Oregon, in silver reflections and wrapped the small college town in a peaceful silence. Leaves drifted across the sidewalks, and the cool air carried the scent of pine and wet earth. Most students hurried between classes with their heads lowered against the rain. Mason Carter walked more slowly. At 19, Mason had mastered the art of blending into the background. He was the kind of person who remembered everyone's coffee order but rarely shared his own thoughts. His professors admired his quiet dedication, while classmates simply called him kind. Yet kindness often came with loneliness. After losing his mother 2 years earlier, Mason had learned to carry grief without speaking about it. He smiled when people expected him to smile and answered every question with, "I'm doing okay." Very few people knew that "okay" had become another word for alone. That afternoon, the campus library became his escape from the weather. The old brick building smelled of paper, cedar shelves, and fresh coffee drifting from the reading lounge. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows while soft music played through hidden speakers. Mason settled into his favorite corner with a notebook and a stack of history books. He had barely opened the first page when someone stopped beside his table. "Excuse me." The voice was calm, almost hesitant. Mason looked up. The young man standing there was unfamiliar, though he looked close to Mason's age. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the edges, thoughtful blue eyes, and a faded denim jacket damp from the rain. His name was Declan Brooks. Mason recognized him from literature class. They had never spoken. "I think you dropped this yesterday," Declan said quietly. He placed a small cassette tape on the table. Mason frowned. "I don't think it's mine." Declan looked down at the label. Written across the faded white sticker were 2 simple words. "For someone honest." "I'm sorry," Declan said with an embarrassed smile. "I must have picked up the wrong one." He reached for it, then paused. His expression changed, almost as if he had made a sudden decision. "Actually," he looked at Mason with unexpected seriousness. "Maybe it belongs with you." Before Mason could ask another question, Declan gently pushed the cassette toward him. "If you decide to listen," he hesitated, "please listen until the end." Then he quietly walked away. Mason watched him disappear between the tall bookshelves. The encounter lasted less than a minute, yet it lingered in his thoughts for the rest of the afternoon. The cassette looked old, older than either of them. Its clear plastic case carried tiny scratches from years of use. There was no artist's name, no song list, only those handwritten words, "For someone honest." By evening, the rain had become heavier. Mason returned to the small house he rented near campus. Boxes filled with old belongings still lined one wall of the living room, untouched since his mother's passing. As he searched through them, he remembered something: an old cassette player. It had belonged to his father long before music became digital. After several minutes, he finally found it beneath a dusty blanket. Surprisingly, it still worked. He placed the cassette inside. The wheels began turning with a quiet click. Static filled the room. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a young man's voice emerged. Soft. Careful. A little nervous. "If someone is listening." The voice paused. "Thank you for giving this tape a chance." Mason leaned forward. "This isn't a love letter," the recording continued. "It's more like a collection of memories I never found the courage to say out loud." A gentle laugh followed. "I've always been better at talking to empty rooms than to people." Mason couldn't help smiling. There was something comforting about the honesty in that voice. The recording continued. It spoke about growing up in a quiet town, about feeling different without understanding why, about pretending to be fearless while secretly worrying about disappointing everyone. There were stories about sunsets over the lake, long walks after school, the sound of rain against bedroom windows. Nothing dramatic, just moments. Real moments. By the end of the recording, Mason realized he had been listening for nearly 40 minutes. Before the tape stopped completely, the voice returned one last time. "If this cassette ever reaches someone who understands loneliness." Another pause. I hope it reminds you that silence isn't the only place where feelings can live. The recording clicked to an end. The room became quiet once again. Mason sat motionless. He had expected music. Instead, he had heard someone's heart. The following morning, Mason searched the campus hoping to find Declan. He wanted to return the cassette, or perhaps ask why it had been given to him. Instead, Declan seemed to have disappeared. His seat in literature class remained empty. The library staff hadn't seen him. Even the campus cafe employees simply shrugged. He hasn't been around today. Days passed. The cassette remained inside Mason's backpack. He listened to it again, then again. Each time, different details stood out. A nervous laugh, a shaky breath, moments of hope hidden between quiet sentences. Without realizing it, Mason began looking forward to hearing that familiar voice after difficult days. Felt strangely comforting, as though someone he barely knew somehow understood the loneliness he had never learned to explain. Late Friday afternoon, Mason finally spotted Declan sitting alone beneath a large maple tree overlooking the river. Golden leaves drifted gently around him. He held a sketchbook on his lap but wasn't drawing. He simply watched the flowing water. Mason walked closer. Declan looked up. A small smile appeared. "You listened." Mason nodded. "I did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, felt patient, almost welcoming. Finally, Mason held out the cassette. "I think this belongs to you." Declan looked at it, then slowly shook his head. "No." His smile carried both hope and uncertainty. "I think it found exactly the person it was meant to find." The wind carried another shower of autumn leaves between them. Neither young man knew it yet, but that small cassette had already begun changing both. Monday morning arrived beneath a sky the color of pale silver. The rain had finally stopped, leaving tiny drops of water clinging to every tree branch around the campus. Students hurried toward their classrooms, laughing about weekend plans and unfinished assignments. Mason Carter noticed none of it. His thoughts remained with the old cassette resting safely inside his backpack. He had listened to it 4 times over the weekend, not because he was searching for answers, because the voice on the recording somehow made the silence inside his own heart feel less lonely. As he crossed the campus courtyard, he noticed someone sitting on the edge of the fountain. Declan Brooks. He wore the same faded denim jacket, though the morning sun now revealed the tiny patches sewn onto one sleeve. His sketchbook rested beside him while he quietly watched a pair of birds chasing each other across the grass. When he noticed Mason approaching, a gentle smile appeared. "You came." "I said I would. I wasn't sure." Mason sat beside him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt surprisingly comfortable. Declan finally broke the silence. "So." He looked toward the fountain instead of at Mason. "What did you think?" Mason smiled faintly. It didn't sound like someone trying to impress anyone. Declan laughed softly. "I've never been very good at that." It sounded honest. Declan's smile slowly faded into something quieter. "That's all I wanted." The breeze carried a few golden leaves between them. Mason studied his face carefully. There was kindness in Declan's eyes, but there was something else too. A sadness that seemed far older than 19. "You recorded all of that yourself?" Declan nodded. "Over several months." "Why?" He took a slow breath. "Because sometimes speaking into a recorder feels easier than speaking to another person." Mason understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. "I know what that's like." Declan looked surprised. "You do?" "My mother passed away 2 years ago." The words came out quietly, without planning them. Declan didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty comfort. He simply listened. After a long pause, he spoke. "I'm sorry." "So am I." Another silence settled between them. This one carried understanding instead of uncertainty. From that morning forward, something gentle began growing between them. Not all at once. One quiet conversation at a time. They started meeting after literature class. Sometimes they studied together inside the library. Sometimes they walked along the river where the water reflected the changing autumn colors. Declan often carried his sketchbook. Mason always carried a novel. Neither questioned the other's habits. One afternoon, Declan quietly turned his sketchbook toward Mason. Inside was a pencil drawing of the campus bridge at sunset. The details were remarkable. Every reflection on the water, every shadow beneath the trees, every fallen leaf. "You drew this?" Declan nodded shyly. "I like drawing places that make people slow down." Mason smiled. "It feels peaceful." "I hope so." He hesitated. "Peace can be difficult to find." Mason looked at him. "You say things that sound simple." Declan chuckled. "They usually aren't." The days passed gently. For the first time in years, Mason found himself looking forward to mornings. Not because of his classes, because he knew Declan would probably be waiting somewhere nearby. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes with a new sketch, sometimes with nothing more than quiet company. Neither seemed to need constant conversation. Their friendship settled naturally into comfortable silence. Yet not everyone misunderstood silence the way they did. Jordan Hayes certainly didn't. Jordan had been Mason's closest friend since freshman year. Confident and outgoing, he believed every problem could be solved through conversation. One afternoon, he found Mason sitting beneath the old maple tree with Declan. Jordan smiled politely. "So this is where you've been disappearing." Mason laughed. "We're just talking." "You've been just talking every afternoon this week." Declan lowered his eyes toward his sketchbook. Jordan noticed. His smile became more careful. "I didn't mean anything by it." "It's okay," Declan answered softly. Jordan looked between them. "I just haven't seen Mason smile this much in a long time." Mason felt warmth rise into his face. Declan looked away. The conversation moved on, but something subtle had changed. As Jordan walked away, Declan became quieter than usual. "You okay?" Mason asked. Declan forced a small smile. "Yeah." "You don't sound convinced." "I'm just—" He searched for the right words. "Not used to becoming important in someone's daily routine." Mason frowned gently. "You've become important to mine." The sentence escaped before he realized he had spoken aloud. Declan looked genuinely surprised. His eyes softened. "So have you." Neither said anything after that. The moment felt too fragile, too honest. Days later, Mason arrived early at the library carrying 2 cups of coffee. Declan wasn't there. He waited 20 minutes. 30. Nearly an hour. Finally, he saw Declan outside the large front window. But he wasn't alone. Jordan stood beside him. They seemed deep in conversation. Jordan placed a reassuring hand on Declan's shoulder. Declan smiled sadly before nodding. From inside the library, the moment looked strangely intimate. Mason's chest tightened. He looked away before either of them noticed him. When Declan finally entered the library, Mason was already gathering his books. "There you are," Declan said with relief. "I've been looking for you. I had some reading to finish." His voice sounded distant even to himself. Declan noticed immediately. "Is something wrong?" "No." "You've barely looked at me." "I'm just tired." It wasn't true. Declan wanted to ask another question. Instead, he quietly nodded. "If you need space, I'll see you tomorrow." Before Declan could answer, Mason walked away. Watching him disappear through the library doors left a heavy feeling inside Declan's chest. Across the room, Jordan noticed everything. He quietly closed the book he had been pretending to read. Then he whispered to himself, "Silence is starting to win again." Outside, evening settled over the campus. Neither Mason nor Declan realized how quickly a simple misunderstanding could grow when 2 people feared asking the questions that mattered most. And somewhere inside Mason's backpack, the old cassette remained safely tucked away, waiting for the truth it had not yet finished telling. Autumn settled deeper over Ashford. The bright orange leaves that had once danced through the campus now rested quietly along the sidewalks, crushed beneath hurried footsteps. The air had turned colder, and the days ended earlier, leaving long shadows across the river where Mason and Declan had spent so many peaceful afternoons. Something between them had changed. Neither of them knew how to fix it. Since the afternoon Mason had seen Jordan talking with Declan outside the library, an invisible wall had begun growing between them. It wasn't built from anger. It was built from unanswered questions. Declan still sent short messages asking if Mason wanted to meet after class. Sometimes Mason replied with polite excuses. Other times he didn't reply at all. Every unanswered message left Declan staring at his phone a little longer than before. Every silence convinced Mason that he had already been replaced. One chilly Friday evening, Jordan finally found Mason sitting alone beside the river. "You've been avoiding him." Mason kept his eyes on the water. "I've just been busy." Jordan sighed. "You've never been a good liar." For several moments, only the sound of the flowing river filled the space between them. Then Jordan spoke again. "You think Declan is hiding something?" Mason looked up. "Isn't he?" Jordan hesitated. "I think he's trying to protect someone." "Who?" Jordan lowered his eyes. "I can't answer that." Those words only deepened the confusion. When Jordan walked away, Mason remained on the bench until sunset disappeared behind the hills. That night, unable to sleep, he looked at the old cassette again. He turned it over in his hands. For the first time, he noticed something strange. Tiny handwritten letters near the bottom. Side B. He frowned. He had never listened to the second side. Carefully, he placed the cassette into the player. The tape turned. Static crackled softly. Then Declan's familiar voice returned. "If you've reached this side." A nervous laugh followed. "It means you stayed." Mason smiled without realizing it. The recording continued. "I almost erased these next words 100 times. I kept telling myself they didn't belong here." Another long pause. "Maybe they still don't." The sound of slow breathing filled the room. Then Declan spoke again. "There was someone I met this semester. He doesn't know how much he changed my life." He listens without interrupting. He notices little things everyone else misses. He reminds me that kindness still exists. Mason's heart began beating faster. He probably thinks this is only friendship. Maybe that's safer. I don't want him to carry the weight of feelings he never asked for. The tape clicked briefly before continuing. "I'd rather lose the chance to be loved than lose someone who makes the world feel less lonely." Mason closed his eyes. Every word felt painfully sincere. Then the recording suddenly stopped. Not because it had ended, because someone had pressed the stop button. Mason stared at the player. The message wasn't finished. The final truth was missing. The next morning, determined to understand everything, Mason searched for Declan across campus. He finally found him in the art building, quietly packing away his sketchbooks. "Declan!" He turned immediately. Relief crossed his face. "Mason!" I listened to the other side. The color slowly disappeared from Declan's face. "You, what? You never told me there was more." Declan looked down. "I didn't think anyone would ever hear it." "You stopped recording." "I know." "Why?" Declan's fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. "Because someone walked into the room." "Who?" Declan didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the hallway, almost as if hoping the conversation would disappear. Before either of them could speak again, another voice interrupted. "Mason!" Jordan stood a few feet away. His expression carried quiet regret. "I think it's time you both knew the truth." Neither young man moved. Jordan slowly approached. "I was the one who interrupted that recording." Declan closed his eyes. "I asked you not to tell him." "I know." "When Declan played that recording for me months ago, he wanted my opinion. He wasn't planning to give it to anyone." Mason struggled to understand. "Then why did he?" Jordan smiled sadly. "Because after he met you." He looked toward Declan. "He couldn't stop talking about you." Declan looked away. Embarrassment and fear filled his expression. "I told him he should be honest," Jordan continued. "But he believed honesty would ruin everything." So the cassette, Mason whispered, was never supposed to reach me. Declan finally spoke. No. His voice trembled. It wasn't. Then why did you give it to me? Declan looked directly into Mason's eyes for the first time in days. Because every time I tried talking to you, he swallowed hard. I lost my courage. Silence filled the hallway. Not uncomfortable. Heartbreaking. Then Jordan quietly reached into his backpack. He removed another cassette. This is the original recording. Declan's eyes widened. You still had it? Jordan nodded. I kept it because I thought one day you'd be brave enough to finish what you started. He placed it gently into Declan's hands. Then he looked at both of them. I've made enough mistakes trying to protect people. He smiled sadly. I'm not making another one. Without another word, Jordan walked away. Declan stood frozen, holding the cassette as though it carried years of unanswered questions. Mason looked at him quietly. So? His voice barely rose above a whisper. There's still something I haven't heard. Declan nodded. There is. He looked down at the cassette, then back at Mason. The last part. He took a slow, unsteady breath. Changes everything. The evening sun slipped through the hallway windows, painting the floor in warm golden light. For the first time since they had met, neither fear nor misunderstanding stood between them. Only one final truth remained, and both of them knew that once it was spoken, neither of their lives would ever be the same again. The sun disappeared behind the hills before either of them left the art building. The hallway had grown quiet. Most students had already gone home, leaving only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of rain beginning once again outside. Declan still held the original cassette in his hand. He looked at it for several long moments before letting out a slow breath. I never thought I'd see this again. Mason stood beside him without speaking. For the first time, silence didn't feel like a wall between them. It felt like a bridge they were learning to cross together. Do you want to hear it? Declan asked. Mason nodded. If you're ready. Declan offered a small, uncertain smile. I've been trying to be ready for months. They walked together through the rain to Declan's apartment, a modest second-floor place overlooking a quiet street lined with maple trees. The apartment reflected its owner perfectly. Books filled every shelf. Finished sketches rested against the walls. A record player stood beside a window covered with tiny raindrops. Everything felt warm. Everything felt carefully loved. Declan disappeared into his bedroom and returned carrying an old cassette player. He placed the original tape inside. Neither of them spoke as the wheels began to turn. Soft static filled the room. Then the familiar recording continued from the exact moment where it had once stopped. The younger version of Declan took a nervous breath. If you're hearing this. Another pause. Then I finally found enough courage to let someone know the truth. His voice sounded quieter than before, almost fragile. There is someone who keeps appearing in my thoughts. He probably doesn't realize it. He smiles when he's nervous. He apologizes even when nothing is his fault. He notices lonely people before anyone else does. Mason lowered his eyes. Every sentence felt deeply personal. The recording continued. I don't know what tomorrow will look like. I don't know what any of these feelings are supposed to mean. I only know that when life becomes too heavy, he somehow makes it lighter. Declan, standing beside the cassette player, closed his eyes. The words still affected him even after all this time. Then the final part began. If I never give this recording to him, I hope at least I was honest once. If I do give it to him, a quiet laugh escaped the speaker. I hope he understands that friendship was never something I wanted to lose. I only wanted the courage to stop hiding. The tape reached its end. A soft click echoed through the room. Nothing more. No dramatic confession. No grand declaration. Only simple honesty. The apartment remained completely still. Mason slowly looked toward Declan. You really believed I'd leave? Declan nodded. I convinced myself that I would. You never even gave me the chance to decide. I know. Regret filled every word. I've apologized to myself for that every day. Mason walked toward the rain-covered window. Outside, streetlights reflected across the wet pavement. When my mother passed away, he said quietly, I stopped believing people stayed. Declan listened without interrupting. I thought if I expected people to leave first, it would hurt less. He smiled sadly. It never did. Declan stepped closer. I wasn't planning to leave. I know that now. Another silence settled between them, gentle, honest, comfortable. After several moments, Declan opened a small wooden drawer beside the bookshelf. Inside rested dozens of cassette tapes. Every label carried a different date. Mason looked surprised. You made all of these? Declan laughed softly. I've been recording my thoughts since I was 16. So many. I never knew how else to organize my feelings. He picked up one cassette. This one was recorded after my grandfather passed away. Another. This one was after my first week at college. Then another. And this, he smiled shyly, was recorded after I met you. Mason looked at the growing collection. Quiet moments, private fears, small hopes. You've spent years talking into empty rooms, Mason whispered. Declan nodded. I guess I was always hoping someone would eventually listen. I did. You did. A warmth settled over the room that had nothing to do with the heater quietly humming nearby. For the first time, neither young man felt misunderstood. Later that evening, they walked onto the apartment balcony. The rain had stopped. Clouds slowly drifted apart, revealing a sky filled with stars. Neither hurried to speak. Some moments deserved quiet. Finally, Mason smiled. You know what surprised me most? Declan looked over. What? The recording never asked me for anything. It wasn't supposed to. It just wanted to tell the truth. Declan nodded. That's all honesty ever does. Mason looked toward the stars. I spent weeks believing that Cassette was hiding something terrible. And instead, it was hiding someone who was afraid. Declan laughed quietly. That's probably the most accurate description anyone has ever given me. Mason smiled. I don't think you're afraid anymore. Declan considered the words carefully. I'm still afraid. Really? Every day. Then what's different? He looked directly at Mason. I don't want fear making my choices anymore. The wind carried the scent of fresh rain through the cool night air. Mason slowly reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the old cassette Declan had first given him. Its edges were worn from being carried everywhere. He handed it back. I think this belongs to both of us now. Declan accepted it carefully, not as though it were simply an old recording, but as though it represented everything they had finally stopped hiding. Together, they watched the stars in peaceful silence. Neither knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. They still had healing ahead of them. They still had difficult conversations waiting. But for the first time since their paths had crossed in the library, they were no longer carrying those fears alone. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something far stronger than either of them had ever imagined. Spring arrived almost unnoticed. The snow melted from the rooftops, the river flowed freely again, and the maple trees outside the campus library slowly filled with fresh green leaves. The same paths that had once carried uncertainty now welcomed new beginnings. Ashford looked brighter. So did Mason and Declan. Neither of them rushed to define what had changed. After the night they listened to the final recording, they made a quiet promise to each other. No more hiding. No more letting fear speak before honesty. Healing didn't happen all at once. Some mornings were easy. Others brought old doubts back without warning. Whenever that happened, they talked. Sometimes over coffee. Sometimes during long walks beside the river. Sometimes while sitting in complete silence on the old wooden bench where their friendship had truly begun. Little by little, trust returned. One conversation at a time. One honest moment after another. A month later, the college announced its annual Spring Arts Festival. Students from every department would display paintings, photography, music, and creative projects. Declan surprised everyone by signing up. He had spent years hiding his artwork inside sketchbooks that almost nobody had seen. This time was different. When Mason asked why he had changed his mind, Declan smiled. "I've spent enough years hiding things." Mason understood. The exhibition hall filled with visitors throughout the afternoon. Families wandered slowly from one display to another. Friends laughed together while pointing at paintings and photographs. Near the center of the room stood Declan's collection. 12 pencil drawings. Each one captured an ordinary moment. A rainy window, a quiet library, an empty park bench, a sunrise over the river. People stopped longer than expected in front of every drawing. There was something deeply peaceful about them, something familiar. Near the final sketch rested a small handwritten note. Simply read, "The people who quietly save us rarely know they are doing it." Mason stood reading those words for several moments. He didn't notice Declan walking toward him until a gentle voice broke the silence. "You recognized it." Mason looked up. "The river, the library, the bench, they're all ours." Declan nodded. "They've always been." For the first time, there was no hesitation in the way they looked at each other. Only quiet understanding. Later that evening, Jordan found them sitting outside beneath strings of warm lights hanging across the campus courtyard. He carried 3 cups of coffee. "I figured someone should celebrate." Mason laughed. "You mean celebrate Declan finally letting people see his art?" Jordan smiled. "That." He looked between them. "And a few other things." Declan shook his head with a grin. "You always know more than everyone else." "No." Jordan handed them each a coffee. "I just stopped making assumptions." The 3 friends laughed together. Months earlier, such a moment would have seemed impossible. Now it felt completely natural. Before leaving, Jordan paused. "I'm glad neither of you gave up." After he walked away, Declan quietly watched him disappear across the courtyard. "He helped more than either of us realized." Mason nodded. "We all made mistakes." "We did. But we also stayed." A few weeks before graduation, Mason received an unexpected package. There was no return address. Inside rested a brand new blank audio cassette. Alongside it lay a folded note written in Declan's familiar handwriting. "Stories deserve more than one voice. Whenever you're ready. I'd like to hear yours too." Mason smiled for a long time. That evening, he visited Declan's apartment carrying the empty cassette. Without saying a word, he placed it on the coffee table. Declan looked at it, then at Mason. "I think it's my turn." Declan handed him the cassette recorder. Mason turned it over in his hands. He laughed softly. "I have no idea what to say. You don't have to sound perfect." "I don't." Declan smiled warmly. "You never did." Mason pressed the red record button. A small light appeared. For several seconds, he simply listened to his own breathing. Then he began. "My name is Mason Carter. I used to believe silence was the safest place to keep my heart." He looked toward Declan. "I was wrong." Declan's eyes quietly filled with tears, not from sadness, from relief. For the first time, Mason was no longer hiding behind carefully chosen words. He was simply telling the truth. Graduation arrived beneath a bright blue sky. Students celebrated across the campus lawn, while families filled the seats surrounding the outdoor stage. After the ceremony ended, Mason and Declan walked toward the river one final time. The water sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. The old wooden bench still stood exactly where it always had. They sat together without speaking. Some silences were no longer empty. They had become peaceful places where 2 hearts could simply exist. After several minutes, Declan reached into his backpack. He removed the very first cassette, the worn one labeled in faded handwriting, "For someone honest." He smiled. "I almost threw this away. I'm glad you didn't." "So am I." Carefully, he placed it into Mason's hands. "It doesn't belong to me anymore." Mason looked at the cassette that had quietly changed both of their lives. A simple object. An ordinary recording. Yet it had carried fear, hope, regret, forgiveness, and finally the courage to be seen. He slipped it safely into his jacket pocket. "I'll keep it." Declan looked toward the river. "You know, when I first met you in the library, I thought I was giving a stranger an old cassette." Mason smiled. "And now?" Declan turned to him. "Now I know I was giving my future to the only person who would truly listen." Emotion settled gently between them. There was no need for dramatic promises. No need for perfect words. Declan slowly reached for Mason's hand. This time, there was no uncertainty. Mason gladly held it. The breeze carried the scent of fresh spring blossoms across the water as the sun dipped lower in the sky. They sat together, watching the river continue its quiet journey forward. Life had not erased their pain. It had transformed it into understanding. The cassette had never been about finding the perfect words. It had always been about finding the courage to speak them. And as the evening light reflected across the flowing water, Mason realized something that once seemed impossible. Home was never a place. Home was the person who stayed when the truth finally arrived. Their story had begun with a forgotten cassette. It ended with two hearts choosing honesty over fear. And from that day forward, neither of them allowed silence to tell their story again. The end. Did you like this feature?